Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's the last day of April, April 30th, 2020. And once again, I have a huge stack of news to comment on. I appreciate the indulgence of people who like the extended podcast, as long as an hour, sometimes even more. And one of the items that grabbed my attention when I was having some cornflakes and reading the morning San Francisco Chronicle was a truncated, edited report that said that the FBI has released some documents that confirm direct communication between Roger Stone, the inveterate liar and dirty trickster who was part of the Trump campaign unofficially in 2016, and the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange. And it's fascinating because the Chronicle report didn't highlight that this communication occurred in 2017, meaning that it had no relationship to the WikiLeaks dumps during the 2016 election and the allegations that were never proven publicly that Roger Stone had some direct communication link with Julian Assange in 2016. And you remember Randy Credico, sometime comic, sometime journalist. He showed real principle by refusing to lie for Roger Stone. And what we learn here in the full report at the Washington Post today, it opens this way. Weeks after Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel in the Russia investigation, Roger Stone reassured WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in a Twitter message that if prosecutors came after him, quote, I will bring down the entire house of cards. Now, like so many things uttered by Roger Stone, he wasn't serious. He did not deliver for Julian Assange. But the communications link in the minds of many people who don't pay close attention will be, aha, Roger Stone was in communication directly with Julian Assange in 2016, urging him to dump more of the information that Mueller claimed had been hacked by Russia and delivered to WikiLeaks. And that central assertion of the entire Russiagate narrative remains publicly unproven to this day. And so the media accounts, the Democratic leaders who wanted to blame Russia for Hillary Clinton's loss, the entire faith in St. Bob Mueller, well, it is held as faith and fact by many people today. So the documents were FBI affidavits submitted to obtain search warrants in the criminal investigation into Stone. They were released following a court case brought by the Associated Press and other media organizations. And in a June 2017 direct message via Twitter, Stone reassured Assange that the issue was still nonsense. And as a journalist, it doesn't matter where you get your information, only that it is accurate and authentic. And he referred to the Pentagon Papers ruling from the Supreme Court back in 1971, and then said, if the U.S. government moves on you, I will bring down the entire house of cards. With the trumped-up sexual assault charges dropped, I don't know of any crime you need to be pardoned for. Best regards are for Roger. Now he's referring to the claims that came from Sweden that were the basis of extradition attempts that Assange ducked by holding up in the Embassy of Ecuador in London for some 7 years. And Assange communicated with Roger Stone. There's this quote, between CIA and DOJ, they're doing quite a lot. On the DOJ side, that's coming most strongly from those obsessed with taking down Trump, trying to squeeze us into a deal. So I find this very interesting, and we know that it will be used to once again support Mueller's investigation, which was a limited hangout that did not produce evidence, and he could not find enough to support the so-called collusion that the Trump campaign was accused of. And I'll note that this came up in a separate report a week or two ago, but the Justice Department has quietly dropped Mueller's indictments. They were so rich in detail of the 12 Russians tied to that internet troll farm in St. Petersburg and those who were named as part of the GRU plot to hack the DNC. And separately at the New York Times, in their second paragraph on this story, which mostly parallels the quotes from the Post, the records revealed the extent of communications between Stone and Assange, whose anti-secrecy website published Democratic emails hacked by Russians. Once again, the New York Times cites no evidence to support that assertion. But they do say that this dump by the FBI is the extent of those communications, which means that Randy Credico still stands out as credible in the Roger Stone investigation that led to his conviction for lying to the FBI. Now, separately, there have been documents released to the trial court that convicted Michael Flynn, Trump's very first national security advisor. And, of course, we know that Flynn was accused of lying to the FBI and lying to Vice President Pence about his pre-inaugural communications with Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to Washington. And we have to begin by saying that Mike Flynn should have known better. He had run one of the intelligence agencies, the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. He knew the extent of the surveillance of people in his position. It's continual. And he should have known, we learned from this report today, that there were deliberations at the highest ranks of the FBI. This is a delicate matter. Here's one of Trump's appointees. We're going to go to the White House and ask him if he lied. And if he lies to us, then he is vulnerable to criminal charges. And so they were sensitive to the perception that they were entrapping him, even as, in my view, they did entrap him. And I'm not saying that this is a trivial matter. But as I said, Mike Flynn should have known better. And they even tipped him off when the number 2 at the FBI, who has since left the agency, you remember him, Andy McCabe. I believe he's now a paid advisor or a commentator on MSNBC. We haven't seen much of him lately. But he tipped Flynn off. He called him ahead of time to make an appointment for his agents, including the now discredited Peter Strzok, to visit with Flynn. And Flynn asked him, hey, what's it about? Is it about my conversations with Kislyak? And McCabe said yes. Now, they did everything they could to tip this guy off. And basically, all he had to do was tell them the truth. And probably nothing would happen, a slap on the wrist at best. And so this is an excruciating shit show. You can't even call it a comedy of errors. Because each side knew what the other was up to, and nevertheless, Flynn took the bait, walked into the trap, lied again, and then they claimed that it was his lies to Pence that led to his dismissal. So it is just bizarre, and the lawyers for Flynn, his latest team, are trying to convince a pretty tough judge, Emmett Sullivan, that their guy should walk. Nobody comes out of this one smelling good at all. And separately, the FBI was forced to disclose, under recent reforms that are modest at best, the level of its requests for the warrants from the the number of targets of wiretap and search warrants sought from the super-secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court in 2019. And you'll be happy to hear that it declined by about a third. The year before, it was, it's a little more than a third. It was 1,800 applications, and in 2019, it was a mere 1,059. And as you know, I believe that it's not the Carter-Page case that should drive members of both parties to impose sharp reforms on this secret court that has no place in what's left of our system of justice. But I don't expect that to happen, at least not anytime soon. So now it's fascinating to see that Trump, who of course has denounced the deep state, has denied intelligence reports that came from the CIA and other parts of the tentacles of our national security establishment. But now he appears to be demanding that they provide proof that COVID-19 came from a government laboratory in Wuhan, China. Now, I am open on this question, as you know. I don't know if COVID-19 originated in a laboratory, but there is interesting speculation based on a review of the RNA that I shared with you earlier this week from a Nobel Prize-winning medical researcher in France, Luc Montagnier. He said that his analysis shows that it probably was made in a lab because it included some strains of HIV. And Montagnier was one of the people credited with finding the source of the HIV, which, of course, is what leads to the AIDS infection. So even the intelligence community is squirming at this. Some analysts are concerned that the pressure from administration officials will distort assessments about the virus, and they could be used as a political weapon in an intensifying battle with China. There are other aides who are saying, hey, we kind of need China right now. They've got all that medical supply stuff that we don't have, and who knows how long this pandemic will be raging in the United States. And this has caused the hand-picked flunky, Richard Grenell, who now sits atop the entire spook establishment. He's the director of national intelligence, and he issued a statement that while he will continue to rigorously examine emerging information and intelligence to determine whether the outbreak began through contact with infected animals or the result of an accident at a laboratory in Wuhan, and his statement went on that intelligence agencies concur with the wide scientific consensus that the COVID-19 virus was not man-made or genetically modified. Now, all of this eliminates speculation or just ignores that this could have come from the American biological weapons sector, and we know there was a breach at Fort Detrick in August of 2019, but the media never addresses that, and of course that's not part of the political gamesmanship that is going on now. The New York Times says, in government and academia, experts have ruled out the notion that it was concocted as a bioweapon. They agree the new pathogen began as a bat virus that evolved naturally, probably in another mammal, to become adept at infecting and killing humans. And honest reporting would be, we don't know. And who are you going to trust in this hall of mirrors? The CIA, which Mike Pompeo, a recent director, says, proudly that we lie, we steal, we cheat. And I, like I say, remain open-minded. The Wuhan Institute of Virology has been criticized for lax standards, even before the current coronavirus. And then the New York Times buttresses the denials, citing scientists, and they name a few, The odds were astronomical against a lab release as opposed to an event in Nature, said Christian G. Anderson, the lead author of a paper published in Nature Medicine and a specialist in infectious disease at the Scripps Research Translational Institute here in California. He said there just isn't a reason to consider the lab as a potential explanation. Then Daniel Lucy, Georgetown, expert on pandemics. No evidence supports the theory that the coronavirus originated in a laboratory, either intentionally or by accident. And to their credit, the Times quotes Richard Ebright, microbiologist, biosafety expert, Rutgers University. He says the probability of a lab accident was substantial, pointing to a history of such occurrences that have infected researchers. The Wuhan labs and other centers that examine naturally occurring viruses have questionable safety rules. The standards are lax and need to be tightened. And that's just kind of the, ritual counterquote that you often expect from mainstream media. So Chris Patten, former Governor General of Hong Kong, a longtime critic of Chinese efforts to control democracy there, has joined the calls for an international inquiry. If I'm not wrong, he was the last British Governor General of Hong Kong before the handover in, was it 1999? Then from Australia, where the Conservative Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and he's been tilting with the Chinese ambassador to Australia, and his envoy to China, the foreign minister of New Zealand. This is separate from Australia. The calls have also been supported by Winston Peters, New Zealand's foreign minister. It's hard to conceive, he said, no matter what country it is, of there not being a desire from every country around the world, including the country of origin, for an investigation to find out how this happened. And I want to cite an email here from Brian Kriowski. He's a listener in Virginia. And he said, I've been having a problem with the conspiracy theory about the coronavirus being created in a lab and having escaped inadvertently or maliciously. And he says, about me, you claim not to be a scientist, so please listen to this BBC podcast, Science in Action. And I've linked to it in the show file for this podcast, so you can listen to it like I did. And I'm always sensitive when people deny things and call them conspiracy theories, because the BBC report is one-sided and simply says that basically crackpots would suggest that this came from a laboratory. And I'm sorry, I don't trust my government. I don't trust other governments that we don't have bio-warfare potential, if not actionable. And so if we're going to be skeptical and properly open-minded about this, we have to consider all of the options. And I do appreciate your email, Brian, and I invite listeners to check out the link that you provided. So all this is backdrop now to Trump's political efforts to blame China for his inept handling on this side of the Pacific of the invasion of COVID-19. So he's got senior U.S. officials beginning to explore proposals for punishing or demanding financial compensation from China for the coronavirus pandemic. And as I mentioned, politically, this is part of his ongoing trade war, his effort to demonize China, and more recently, as I said, to blame them for his problems domestically. And later, we'll see the impact in the polls of Trump's bungling of the coronavirus response. So Trump is described as being fuming and telling aides and others in recent days, blaming China for withholding information about the virus, and he has discussed enacting dramatic measures that would probably lead to retaliation by Beijing. In private, Trump and aides have discussed stripping China of its sovereign immunity, aiming to enable the U.S. government or victims to sue China for damages. Now, this would be unprecedented and would probably, if Pepe Escobar is any indication in our recent interview, simply lead to a hardening in Beijing and efforts to counterattack the United States. Some administration officials have discussed having the U.S. cancel part of its debt obligations to China. Now, they're holding trillions of dollars of U.S. bonds. That would have a devastating impact on the U.S. economy, which has been hammered pretty hard already. So the saner voices in the room say, look, now is not the right time. There will be a time to do it, but that punishing China is definitely where the president's head is at right now. And political advisors want him to take a swing at China. They think it'll help him politically. And the Biden campaign has also been demonizing China. And so they can compete to see who can do the most damage and treat China like Russia has recently been treated in the American emotional and often irrational calculations. So Linda Lewis, in her daily COVID-19 report, has quite a bit here. Let me start with just the figures that are out there today. Worldwide, 230,800 people have died attributed to coronavirus. Here in the United States, the number has ticked up to almost 62,000. And in California, it's interesting because Los Angeles and the surrounding area has nearly half of the death toll so far. We have just under 2,000 deaths reported in California, and 1,065 are in Los Angeles County. And Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley, that was we now believe, the origin, the first case of COVID-19 in the United States. 107 people have died. So you can see that regionally here in California, the continuing threat is very different. Also, in New Jersey, which is having a serious outbreak there, the death toll is equivalent to yesterday's number from New York. In New York, the state number was 330 deaths, and it was 329 in the much smaller neighboring Garden State. And, and we just confirmed that the number in New York hit 306 today, down from 330 yesterday. So Linda also provided some good quotes on the whole issue with China and blaming China. She noted that the CIA has yet to unearth any data beyond circumstantial evidence to bolster the lab theory. According to current and former government officials, the agency has told policymakers it lacks enough information to either affirm or refute it, and only getting access to the lab itself and the virus samples could provide definitive proof, and Mike Pompeo's complained that the U.S. has not gained access. And I'm sure that we're willing to let the Chinese come on down to Fort Detrick and just take a look around. So that false equivalency is not lost on me, at any rate. She also quotes Sam Husseini, who is a good progressive commentator, and he wrote a piece at Salon, noting there's been no scientific finding that the coronavirus was bioengineered, but its origins are not entirely clear. Deathly pathogens discovered in the wild are sometimes studied in labs and sometimes made more dangerous. That possibility and other plausible scenarios have been incorrectly dismissed in remarks by some scientists and government officials and in the coverage by most major media outlets. And I think that is a worthwhile comment from Sam Husseini. And then Linda gives us a pretty deep dive into the situation in Texas, where she now lives. And as you know, Governor Abbott has pretty precipitously called to reopen retail, restaurants, malls, movie theaters. He says it'll be with limited capacity. And the question is, how many Texans will actually take the opportunity to go shopping or to buy some popcorn and watch a movie? And does his move to at least partially reopen Texas meet the federal guidelines, the gating criteria for a phased comeback? It requires a downward trajectory of documented cases within a 14-day period or a downward trajectory, of positive tests within a 14-day period. Now, that second criteria is wobbly because tests have been more widely available. But the numbers in Texas compared to the population are remarkably low. It has administered 315,000 so far, and Abbott has a goal of 30,000 tests per day, which many experts say is too low. So Dallas marked its deadliest day on Tuesday. The HHS director there said some area hospitals have seen increases in COVID-19 populations. At the Parkland Hospital, that people know because it's where JFK died, there are 21 COVID-19 patients in critical condition requiring assisted breathing. The hospital has a total of 67 infected patients, up from 38 about 2 weeks ago. Now, that's just one snapshot of one hospital, but that indicates that Greg Abbott is playing loosey-goosey with the Trump administration's own criteria for this so-called reopening process. And Linda cites a report in the Texas Tribune that local officials are pushing the envelope with Abbott's orders. In one town, they allowed restaurants with patio seating and hair salons to open in advance of the governor's orders. In Montgomery County, a judge said he would allow businesses to reopen tomorrow, including barbershops and gyms, saying that Abbott's new order is uncommonly vague. In Hood County, the county attorney said he would not prosecute a business for defying the governor's orders. And we're seeing this in California. There is one county that has said it is going to thumb its nose at the governor and lift some of the restrictions to reopen businesses there. And here are critical comments. The Dallas Observer's Brian Reinhard writes, 5 ways that Texas's reopening could destroy the restaurant industry. And he said that Abbott's plan to let restaurants reopen with 25% capacity, well, he said that restaurants and their employees will now face rising costs, safety and enforcement problems, and potential showdowns with unsympathetic landlords. Making matters worse, the state of Texas offered just 4 days advance notice before dining rooms can reopen, nowhere near enough time to develop a safe operating plan. And the big cloud hanging over all this is, are people going to get coronavirus inside restaurants? And then, in another section, Linda cites the moral calculus and quotes Jim Schultz, also in the Dallas Observer. He said, in the debate on opening up versus shutting down, a dark picture is emerging, with national ramifications, but some nasty roots closer to home. A truly terrible political calculus may be afoot. The calculus would be this, that the nation will swallow the cost in human lives of reopening the economy if that cost is paid mainly in the lives of non-white immigrants, prisoners, and old people in Medicaid nursing homes. So I think he raises another really serious set of issues. Of course, politics and morality don't intersect very often in these days in this country. A later quote, sacrificing the lives of certain people so that another kind of people can have a good economy won't work because the virus is hungry. And all of us, all kinds and colors, all of the social and economic stripes, all the nationalities, we all taste the same. So this is certainly a conundrum. I wouldn't want to be a governor trying to make these decisions. And we have the political overlay of these Republican governors trying to suck up to Trump. And as I mentioned yesterday, despite his swipes at Brian Kemp in Georgia, which are inconsistent with every other thing he said, like let's reopen by Easter, Trump is trying to have it both ways and pretend that he has been the leader during this crisis who has brought us back to some kind of trend toward normal. I think that's the best way I could describe it. Now, Texas has seen a downward trend in new cases, even if case numbers have fluctuated over the last 2 weeks. Governor Abbott, in the Dallas interview on Tuesday, said the state's percentage of positive tests declined from 10% to 9%. Now, does that give you confidence? This is countered by the largest spike in coronavirus-related deaths on Wednesday, when the Department of State Health Services reported 42 new fatalities, and Linda sent a postscript that in Central Texas, in a 15-county area, there has been a measurable increase in cases. The 15-county area surrounding Greater Austin has averaged 82 new COVID-19 cases every day. That's 18 more than its second highest week, which was April 12th to 18th. And Mason County went from 5 to 17 cases on Wednesday. So I recognize that, the governor runs an entire state and something like 88 counties, maybe even more in Texas. But he appears to be selective about the data that he finds valid. And I've linked to this opinion piece in the New York Times today from Kieran Landman, a doctor who's a specialist in infectious diseases and a native of Georgia, writing, "Last week was a bad one for Georgia and an especially bad one for Governor Brian Kemp. On April 20, he announced he would open Georgia's tattoo parlors, hair and nail salons, and other high-touch businesses as early as April 24, ahead of even Trump's ambitious plans. For better or worse, the governor has made Georgia the nation's canary in this particularly terrifying coal mine. The ham-handed way he went about it makes Georgians of all stripes afraid of what comes next, leaves us wondering whether he's setting us up for a punishing new wave of infections. From my vantage point as a doctor, an epidemiologist, a journalist, and native Georgian, it's clear that if there's anything to be gained from this moment, it's the opportunity to help others avoid our mistakes." And he says, never mind that none of the metrics that Kemp cited, the average of daily cases, the daily deaths, was among the federal gating criteria. And yet, Georgia has plunged ahead into the unknown over the objections of local leaders, both Democrat and Republican. And you can find the link to read the entire essay. It's in the show file at peterbcollins.com. And on this general topic, I got an email yesterday that kind of made me scratch my head from listener Paul Goodman. "Peter, I would like to ask about what the long-term economic consequences of shelter-in-place will be." All right. "Near-term projections could be unemployment rates of up to 30%. What percentage of those people will end up homeless? With the death rate directly attributed to homelessness at around 2.25%, and with a pre-crisis number of homeless nationwide at around 500,000. All right, those are legitimate questions. But then, Paul, are you trying to piss me off with your closer here? I suspect that the cure could be far worse than the disease. Are you channeling Trump and the nutcase on Fox News on Sunday night who fed him that line? It is so vacuous. But the rest of your email, I think, does have merit, and thank you for checking in. Jesse Jackson wrote a piece, and thanks to Jerry Fracia for alerting me to it. It appears at Counterpunch. He says, "Let prisoners go during the pandemic." Opening with this, across the United States and the world, prisoners are among the most vulnerable to the coronavirus. Overcrowded facilities, shortage of food and medicine, and totally inadequate testing expose prisoners who are disproportionately poor and afflicted with prior conditions that render them vulnerable to the disease. Later, he notes, an outbreak of 6 inmates were killed in a federal prison. That's the Marion Prison in Lisbon, Ohio. And the population there has received fewer than 100 tests. And this problem is a pattern across the country. At the federal lockup called Terminal Island in Los Angeles, they have the highest number of coronavirus cases. Nearly half the population, 570, as of yesterday, with 2 deaths so far. The Intercept tells us that in New Jersey prisons, 29 coronavirus deaths have been recorded, with only 184 people tested so far. Yeah, lock them up and throw away the key. That is sadly the mentality here. Every day I like to remind you that we are running the Peter B. Collins Podcast Community Fund, offering $100 grants to listeners and people that they alert to us who are in need and could use it for groceries or to cover the copay on your drugs if you still have health care insurance. And maybe you just need to fill up the tank and you don't have the cash. Now, $100, I'd love to be able to give $1,000 or $10,000, but we are taking money in generously donated by listeners, and we are passing it out in $100 grants. I don't have a request for a grant today, but if you have that need, just fire off an email to peter@peterbcollins.com. And I'm grateful to all of the listeners who have contributed their normal subscription money and additional amounts to the community fund. So yesterday I commented on Dr. Fauci, and once you see the zoom-out picture of him in the White House in this huge meeting with all these people on sofas and Trump at the head of the room, well, I'm sorry, but I am skeptical about his rosy report on the new study of the antiretroviral drug called Remdesivir. Remdesivir, let's get it right. Remdesivir. Now, Dr. Fauci cited the latest study, which is bigger than the previous ones, about 1,000 participants, and he said that it reduced the average day of the number of days of the virus infecting people from 15 days to 11 days. And then he said that back during the heyday of Dr. Fauci and the efforts to discover treatments for AIDS, that the initial results showed this kind of incremental reduction. But that led to further research in the AIDS cocktail that has been incredibly effective. Now, this study comes from China, okay? And we've already talked about the effort to demonize China for, allowing this virus to spread in the first place. And Trump would be wise to, I say, hold off on his punitive efforts. But I want to remind you of other recent studies. One from Wuhan showed no statistically clinical benefit in COVID-19 patients when they were given remdesivir. They tested 200 people, concluded their findings would require confirmation from larger studies, but they stopped the study because of data safety monitoring issues and difficulty in recruiting patients. But it was the first randomized controlled trial of the drug. Then there was the study that was done in Chicago, and it does not appear to have been fully, it was a randomized controlled trial, The researchers recruited 237 people. 158 people got remdesivir, 79 got the placebo. The abstract reports remdesivir use was not associated with a difference in time to clinical improvement and mortality at 28 days. And the rate of recovery under remdesivir was 13.9% compared to the placebo, 12.8%. And the abstract said remdesivir was not associated with clinical or virological benefits. So I say I'm not trying to talk this down. I'm not trying to dash hopes that people have based on what Dr. Fauci said. But I think we have to remain a little skeptical and wait for more research to come in. And Trump is rushing with all of his promises that it's going to disappear, and he trotted out Crown Prince Jared to say we're going to be rocking by July. So you can make up your own minds. Now, Gilead Sciences, the profiteering biotech company here in the Bay Area that charged incredible prices for its hepatitis C treatment protocols, they've announced that they are generously going to give away the first 1.5 million doses of remdesivir. And they haven't decided what price to charge when and if they roll it out in the long run. So we will have to wait and see, and I'll remind you that Gilead received, I believe, $70+ million in taxpayer money to research this drug, originally for treating Ebola. I want to recommend a commentary by Craig Murray. I've referred to him just recently about his potential arrest and detention for supporting a Scottish politician who was found innocent of what Murray believed to be trumped-up sexual crimes. And Murray, who blogged about that, is facing serious repercussions. And yesterday he posted a commentary that I encourage you to read. And at first, he compares the deaths that have been caused by the U.S. and U.K. coalition of death, he called it, in the war in Iraq and the ensuing struggles in the region. And I'll let you read that yourselves, but what he says is the total number of deaths from coronavirus in Britain so far is about half the number of civilians killed directly by the U.S. military in the single city of Mosul. Makes you think, doesn't it? There are 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, he writes, and while of course I do not blame people for focusing on the one which is riding at them right now, do not forget the others. Coronavirus has not finished killing, but then nor have Western wars. And then he declares, I was wrong when I initially wrote about the coronavirus. What he says is that he thinks that the lockdown is wise, and it's because of this. Where I was wrong was in not realizing that what is different about this disease from a flu is that it is really very, very contagious. So far, a higher percentage of the population get it all at once. Over 2 seasons, only about 30% of the British population got the Hong Kong flu. So, he says, the lockdown policies to prevent health services being overwhelmed are needed and do have my support. He continues, I do not, however, support the level of alarmism and panic. Of course, the disease is really appalling for those who get it badly. It's painful, protracted, a terrifying experience. But a similar level of scrutiny of extreme illnesses of other kinds would bring similar stories. And he describes 3 of his own brushes with death. He had a multiple pulmonary emboli, blood clots in both lungs, which left him in a coma for days, was incredibly painful. And he says in 1986, I was actually declared dead in a hospital in northern Nigeria from Salmonella paratyphoid B, and was woken up on a morgue trolley by a cockroach eating my nostril. Okay. So that may be too much information for some people, but I think it establishes his own credibility about facing death. I will concede that none of that has ever happened to me. I've raised over time the fate of crew members of cruise liners. And I want to credit The Guardian for an Enterprise piece today. They searched on 50 stranded ships that are no longer taking on passengers, of course, and discovered that there are 100,000 crew members who are still stranded on those ships. Now, this piqued my interest because I've tried to follow the fate of the crew members of the Grand Princess. That's the ship that came into San Francisco and created the real first alarm here about the potential spread of COVID-19. Many of those passengers were trapped on the ship and then in a loose quarantine at an Air Force base about an hour away from here. And somewhere around 10 people died, passengers, and crew members tested positive. I don't know the fate of any people who died from serving on the crew of the Grand Princess. But today I took a look at that app on my phone and discovered that today the Grand Princess put into port at Los Angeles for about 7 hours. They arrived at 6:19 a.m. and they debarked at 1 p.m. I don't know if they allowed any crew members to disembark. Probably they were there to pick up new provisions. And as of about 3 p.m. my time today, the Grand Princess was drifting near Catalina Island in the company of 20 oil tankers that can't come ashore because there's no place to put that oil. So many of the crew of these cruise ships have had only minimal communication with the outside world. At least 17 cruise ship workers are confirmed to have died from various cruise lines. One crew member said, "We all want to go home." The worker asked not to be named. He said crew were initially allowed to move about the ship freely, but had been told to remain in their cabins. And the PR firm for MSC Cruises says, "Look, we've taken the difficult decision to temporarily suspend cruise ship operations. We're offering all those who remain on board full board and lodging free of charge, assigning each of them a guest cabin for individual use. We've upgraded our menus and are providing complimentary internet." And that's a bunch of bullshit to cover the fact that they've stopped paying these people who only made about $2,000 a month plus tips when the ships were operational. And while we're talking about ships, the U.S. Navy's hospital ship Comfort, which was in New York City, it left the port today after treating just 182 people. So it was not needed in the surge that has now, we hope, dissipated. Oh, and here's another profiteer. This is a guy in Silicon Valley. His name is Yaron Oren Pines. He's an electrical engineer, a specialist in mobile phone technology. And he went on Twitter and directed a message to Donald J. Trump. "We can supply ICU ventilators, invasive and non-invasive. Have someone call me, urgent." But you know who took the bait? The state of New York. They paid Oren Pines almost $70 million for an order for 1,450 ventilators. Not a single one has been delivered to date. The opportunism of the Trump administration continues, citing the pandemic to overturn restrictions, Obama-era regulations, to drill for oil and do mining and timber cuts in Western public lands. The EPA has announced that they're not going to do any enforcement of environmental laws, so just go ahead, pillage the environment. And this is all said to be a response to the coronavirus. Now, I just mentioned those oil tankers drifting off the coast of Southern California because of the worldwide oil glut. So how is it urgent to start drilling on public lands at a time when there is no place to park the oil, much less, that's what I'm trying to say, put it into the oil markets? I've got to severely criticize the New York Times once again for media malpractice. This is in their handling of the case of the credible sexual assault charge brought by Tara Reade against the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden. And you know the story, that Tara Reade says that when she was a staffer to Senator Biden, that he physically assaulted her, digitally penetrating her. And the New York Times dances around this. So Ben Smith, the former BuzzFeed editor who's now a columnist at the Times, he focuses on this from the media's failure to interview Tara Reade, not mentioning that his own newspaper didn't publish anything about it until Biden was the last one standing in the lengthy Democratic primary process after Bernie Sanders had pulled out. And they published it late in the day on Easter Sunday. And their investigation did not draw a conclusion about whether Tara Reade is credible and accurate or whether Joe Biden's denials are accurate. It was a fairly he said, she said kind of presentation. And now the Biden campaign is using that New York Times report. It's in the talking points that BuzzFeed released yesterday and we described, and that were used by Stacey Abrams who could be a vice presidential contender for Biden, and other Democratic Party leaders. And Ben Smith frames this around the woman who accused Bill Clinton of raping her, Juanita Broaddrick. And in a throwaway line, he notes that the Times executive editor, Dean Baquet, said that Tara Reade has standing. All right? But that standing does not reach the point where the New York Times does fair investigation of her claims. And it uses this angle of why the media won't put her on TV without any criticism of the Times itself. And it goes through some of the history of the way this story surfaced with the podcast of Katie Halper, then the coverage in The Intercept, and now the report from Business Insider that was turned down by Vanity Fair. And it notes that the broadcast television networks plus CNN and MSNBC have covered the story on their websites, but not on the tube. And Fox has breathlessly covered the developments on air and online. And Smith writes, there's still no clear explanation for why Ms. Reade hasn't been on mainstream TV. Representatives for CNN and MSNBC declined to explain why they haven't booked a woman who is, whether you believe her or not, one of the few newsmakers right now who could cut through the pandemic. And they quote Ryan Grimm, who has done good work on this at The Intercept. Quote, typically in a situation like this, media outlets would be competing intensely for the first major on-camera interview. Yet the only network calling Reade is Fox News. Now, she says she's turned down Sean Hannity, but because nobody else is asking her, she's going to appear on Fox this weekend, probably with Chris Wallace. And that is a widespread media blackout, friends. And then to pay lip service to all this, the two reporters who wrote the first piece for the Times that I referenced, published on Easter Sunday, they follow up by describing the angst that Joe Biden's silence has caused for particularly women in the Democratic Party and women who support him. And in a backhanded way, at the very end of their article, they note the corroborating witnesses who have been identified and quoted just this week. But it is buried in the story of the political implications and the efforts to get Joe Biden to address it directly. And I find this stunning because these are useful accounts, both the media story and the angle of the women in politics who have to dance around this. But it is no substitute for declarative narratives and even-handed treatment of Tara Reade. It is just infuriating. And as I mentioned yesterday, the Washington Post belatedly is providing better coverage done by its own reporters, not just wire services. And an editorial in the Post has called on Biden to address the claims against him and release any records related to Tara Reade's employment, including any complaints that she may have filed while working in his office. In the words of the Post, Tara Reade deserves to be heard. Voters deserve to hear her, too. They deserve to hear from Joe Biden, too. And Nancy Pelosi, using the Biden campaign's talking points, followed up on her endorsement of Biden from Monday to say that she believes him and is satisfied with his explanations, which are just campaign press releases. On to other news. We learned that Donald Trump last Thursday and Friday had calls with his campaign team. He lit into Brad Parscale, the genius, devious guy who does use the internet to devastating effect for Trump. And Trump is quoted as yelling at Parscale, saying, "I'm not fucking losing to Joe Biden." And at one point he threatened to sue what's his name? And at one point he threatened to sue Parscale, but we're told that the two men have kissed and made up. Now, here's what he's upset about. The Washington Post reports today that he trails Biden by 6.3 points as of this morning in the Real Clear Politics average. His job approval rating has sunk in recent days to under 45%, down from a recent high of 47.3. Though his job approval is still higher than his share of the vote in ballot tests against Biden, he would still trail by more than 3 points, even if he did as well as those ratings, and there's no plausible path to winning the Electoral College if he loses the popular vote by that much on Election Day. Continuing, polls in battleground states show the same thing. Trump trails Biden in GOP-leaning but senior citizen-heavy Florida by more than 3 points. He trails in 2 of the last 3 polls in North Carolina. He is behind in the pivotal state of Arizona by more than 4 points. He's also behind in the Midwestern trio of states that propelled him to presidency, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And as I have argued, I think Joe Biden was weak before Tara Reade's allegations surfaced. I think they weaken him further. But these polls show that Trump could lose, which does not mean that it's because Biden won or is a strong candidate. The reaction to the announcement from Michigan independent libertarian far-right guy Justin Amash is fascinating. Trump is trying to play it this way. He tweeted yesterday morning, that Amash could play a spoiler role in Trump's favor. He compared him to Jill Stein, who won more than 51,000 votes in Michigan in 2016. And the tweet says, he almost always votes for the do-nothing Dems anyway. I like him even more than Jill Stein. And I want to pause to note that the blame Ralph Nader, blame Jill Stein arguments are fatuous. Because there is no guarantee, there is no requirement that only 2 candidates run in our presidential races. And when people get into the hindsight mode and say, well, if only Jill Stein hadn't siphoned off all those votes, there is no indication that those people would have voted in sufficient numbers to elect Hillary. They might have stayed at home. They might have even voted for Trump. And that point is made clear in 2 pieces that I've linked to in the show file related to Amash's announced candidacy. One is from political scientist and pollster Rachel Beitkofer in today's Guardian. And she says, never Trump Republicans worked hard to deter Amash from running, and on his announcement, influencers in that movement, the Never Trumpers, like Jennifer Rubin, Bill Kristol, and Tom Nichols, immediately denounced his candidacy. Their wariness is well supported by polling data, which shows Biden's consistent lead over Trump in head-to-head general election polling narrows when an independent or third-party option is included. It's important to recognize that voters respond to generic independent or third-party cues from their own ideological frame. A progressive probably pictures a progressive candidate, a conservative one. But she says in 2016, the Libertarian Party pulled voters from both sides in equal amounts. And so it's unpredictable at this point. There's also a piece from Republican Liz Mayer. She's a strategist, they call her, a consultant. And I've linked to that as well. She says Amash's move shouldn't have surprised anyone, and it's far from clear that he will hurt Biden more than Trump. And she cites the history that he will be a headache for both parties. And she said, she's a libertarian, I guess. I worked to turn out votes for Johnson in 2016 to protest the major parties. By my rough estimate, 50% of Johnson voters would otherwise have voted for Clinton and 50% for Trump. So stop all that bashing of Jill Stein and Ralph Nader, if you please. Now I have some informed commentary, both from published writers and from 2 different listeners, reacting to the film that I talked about in Monday's podcast, Planet of the Humans, produced by Jeff Gibbs. And the most lucid and unemotional critique of the Gibbs film that I've found so far is written by Timon Wallace. And let me get the bio here. It's at the back of the printout. Tim and Wallace has a BA in human ecology, a PhD in peace studies. He is the executive director of nuclearban.us, a partner in the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. So, he has some substantive criticisms of the film. He opens, "It can be refreshing to watch a true believer taking a deeper look at their own sacred cows, but in his rush to be open-minded about his long-cherished environmental beliefs, Jeff Gibbs has thrown out the baby with the bathwater. He lumps solar and wind power, which hold substantial promise despite their drawbacks, together with the bogus but profitable solutions, biomass and biofuels. And he offers no new solutions, only a bleak reminder that our species' recent exploitation of fossil fuels has both enabled our exponential growth and sealed our fate." So, he says, "It is hugely disingenuous and frankly misleading to hide in the credits at the end of the movie the fact that two of the leading organizations being damned in the movie for their support of biomass, the 350.org and Sierra Club, do not in fact support biomass anymore." Now, one of the valid criticisms I think of this film is that Jeff Gibbs worked on it over a long period of time. Some of the information is a little dated, and, for example, the scene about electric cars using coal power is almost 10 years old. So I think that is fair. And Wallace goes on, "McKibben deserves an apology for being misrepresented in this film, even if he was a supporter of biomass at one point in his career and equivocal about it at other points since then." Now, I don't know the date of the public event where Jeff Gibbs went with his cameras and he captured McKibben, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Van Jones, all waffling about biomass. So that is a particular that deserves my further investigation, and I'll take the cue to do so. But then he agrees with the film. Biomass is a massive contrick that has been hailed like nuclear power as a green alternative to fossil fuels. Then he dings it for what the film doesn't do, and I've criticized this. So many people try to project onto Gibbs' film what should have been in it. And when you're a filmmaker, a documentarian, you get to decide that. And people get to react to whether they think it was fair or not. And he does it again here. "Instead of focusing on biomass, Planet of the Humans sets out to tar all green alternatives with the same disdainful brush." Now, I have linked to this article. I encourage you to read it. I think it does show a fairly even-handed and less emotional approach to the issues. It's still contemptuous of the film. And it does note that there have been advances in both generation and storage. And notes that there's no coverage of hydroelectric power, which, of course, is at risk now because we're declining in hydro here in California because of limited snowfall in the last 10 years. So I think it is a fair piece. Let me give you one more quote. "Planet of the Humans is factually correct in pointing out that everything we might have thought of as green actually turns out to be tainted to some extent or other by association with fossil fuels. But that is hardly surprising, since literally everything we build, buy, or trade has had some kind of fossil fuel input involved in it." So I think that he does make arguments that are worthy of your consideration. Now, here's Paul Leto. He was a guest on our podcast earlier this year, blowing the whistle on a facility where he had worked. And he writes, "Jeff Gibbs' film does a great service. First, by changing our focus to something more important than COVID-19. Second, having accomplished this important shift, the critiques that follow can also be credited to the film, especially when they're accurate, because there's no way this information would get through to our consciousness in face of the COVID-19 blitz. The critique of Kathy Cohen Becker that I cited yesterday proves the sting of the film to be correct. She addresses her critique to Michael Moore, not Jeff Gibbs. The Becker critique asks Moore, not Gibbs, to pull the film. The substance of the critique is that Moore is irresponsible by failing to police his brand. The problem with this critique of the film addressed to Moore is that it proves the sting of the film to be correct. which is that the environmental movement has been co-opted by associating with corporate brands that control them. If Moore is wrong not to police his brand better, then environmental groups are really wrong to take millions of dollars from fossil fuel brands and billionaires who definitely believe in policing their own brands and controlling others to pursue their interests. Good points, Paul. And then our friend John Zwiebel in Hawaii, he lives on Kauai. He headlined his message, "What is the point of Moore's documentary?" And he said after he heard me criticize Vox and the claims or the calls for people to take down the film, he notes that the online TV show Rising with Crystal Ball and I always forget the other guy's name, I'm sorry. And I did watch that interview that included Michael Moore, Jeff Gibbs, and Ozzy What's-His-Name. And Zwiebel writes, the filmmakers specifically disavowed the one major point that they should have been making clear: there are just too many damn people in the world. And I don't think they disavowed it. They simply declined to explain how they think we should reduce the population. And that is a very, very difficult and explosive topic. And they raise it, and I agree, that they don't provide answers, but I don't think there are easy answers. Anyway, he writes, so what is the point of the movie? I have no idea. And he cites other videos that he gets about watching documentaries with teasers. And he said, well, when this documentary finally gets to the last 5 minutes, its horribly framed conclusion is we're all fucked. Then he says to me, you did a great interview a while back. It was a year ago. A year ago, we published it right at the end of April with Guy McPherson. He told the truth boldly and bluntly. He didn't point fingers at people who are trying to do something. He didn't accuse them of being sellouts. Later, John writes that he does have a solar array. My house is hooked up to the grid. I export more power than I consume. Even though I have to pay more for the electricity I use than they pay me for what I export, I still have an account balance in my favor. Well, that's fine, John, and I pointed out yesterday that we can all benefit individually and lower our utility bills and our reliance on fossil fuels with solar arrays. But I believe the purpose of the film was to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. And that, overall, we cannot solve the climate crisis with renewable energies. It's a provocative point. I think it has produced a lot of good conversation, and I'm still waiting to hear back from the PR team on when I can interview Jeff Gibbs or another person associated with the film. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You will find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to